Next up, we have a panel that I have been looking forward to a long time. We're going to have the discussion about evolving role of the Chief Data Officer as California state programs increasingly rely on enterprise data to enhance digital services. This conversation will look at the opportunities and challenges of managing data effectively while safeguarding privacy and navigating complex data sharing regulations. Really amazing panel here. We've got Marianne Bates, the Executive Director of the California Cradle-to-Career Data System, Jason Lally, the State Chief Data Officer within Office of Data and Innovation, Katie Regan, our State Data Services Manager at CDII, Department of Technology, and Agnieszka Rykaczewska, the Deputy Director of the Insights Lab at the CalHHS Center for Data Insights and Innovation. And coming back to the stage to moderate this panel, we have former Secretary of CalHHS and former Special Advisor on Innovation and Digital Services to Governor Newsom, Mike Wilkening. Please welcome our next panel.
Great. Happy to be back on the stage with y'all. Really excited about this panel. I think the way that I think about this is if you don't get this right, the rest of what you're talking about today isn't going to work. So you should really, really pay attention to what these folks have to say about data governance and what you need to actually have an effective data governance program and what that looks like and why that's so terribly important. So I think for the start of this, and yes, I'm going to have to actually wear glasses because I didn't print this out big enough. So let's start the conversation here talking about the foundational issues. When starting out, what should you put in place and what questions should you all ask? And let's open it up to each and every one of you.
Great. Well, I'm happy to start. Sure. I'm Marianne. I'm the Executive Director of the Cradle-to-Career Data System. And one foundational piece, I think, is being clear about your learning agenda. So in other words, being really clear about what are the questions that you can't answer today that are really important, that would change implementation or would change how we think about a policy. What are the questions you can't answer today that you could answer if data were brought together and linked and used in a different way? And that sounds really basic, but I think in this room, if you talk about using data and innovation, everyone's on board. But it's not easy, and it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of legal agreements, which I'm sure we'll be talking about too. And having a clear why really helps. So as a specific example, in 2019, the Cradle-to-Career Data System Act was passed. This was legislation that kicked off the process of making a plan for what this integrated data system that connects education data and earnings data and health and human services data all together in one place. And part of that legislation actually outlined 6 specific topics that were a priority for the state, where the state said, we need to know more about the long-term effects of financial aid for college, for instance. We need to understand the long-term impacts of early learning and care. We need to understand for people who start at community colleges and want to get a 4-year degree, how long does it take them to transfer and get those degrees? So those are just a few of the specific questions that were listed in that legislation. And I think of that as like a mini learning agenda. And being clear about the why from the outset then enabled there to be a lot of clarity around who should be at the table, whose data would be needed to answer that question about transfer students, for instance, or about financial aid. And then once they're at the table, what data points should we actually bring together? What data exists that's already collected and validated? All of that work, years of effort that followed that needed to be kickstarted by a very clear understanding of the why. Why is it that we want to do this work? Why is it that we want to bring everyone together? So that's, as we think about the first questions to start with, I think being clear about your learning agenda, what is the actual question you want to answer with the data is a really important place to start.
I'm actually going to build on a piece that you mentioned too of who needs to be at the table too, right? So oftentimes we think about data and the data people are like, yay, it's data time, it's my moment to shine. Or we talk about technology and the tech people are like, yes, this is my moment. It's not just, yes, data people, tech people need to be at the table, but so do program and policy because they're the ones who can really get at that really meaningful why and build that foundation to build upon. So I think the other piece, and it's one that I think we're really leaning into shifting our mindsets at CalHHS around who needs to be at the table, program, policy, and data working together as equal partners. And I think that does a couple of things. On one hand, policy and program are there to really, at every single moment, at each data decision, at each tech decision, help infuse us with our why and what's going to be meaningful and what's going to be useful. At the same time, it also means that data folks and tech folks are also equal partners in this, and data doesn't become an afterthought. We're intentionally, from the beginning, thinking about what's the right data, why do we need this data? It's not just, oh, it happens to be a byproduct that we're creating, but can we add a question, or can we ask it in a new way, or gather it in a new way to really have more impact with the data that we have at our hands. And so I think the other foundation is really bringing those folks together and helping them understand how they're part of this bigger picture to get us to the big why, how they're part of that why.
One of the things, right, that I just heard from both of you is there is a kind of dedicated data team or data folks who are available to do this work. And I think a lot of time data governance or data work in general can maybe be intimidating, but it is really becoming an ad hoc and kind of foundational part of really everyone's roles now. So it isn't just left to the data individuals or the people with data titles to do the data work. It's becoming democratized, and it's really a part of everyone's role now. And so for me, one of the things that is so critical is to not be intimidated by the concept of a governance program and to be able to start small, even for the teams that don't have dedicated data individuals, but that scoping, those initial early conversations of what data is the most critical that we're working with, where do we need to start to enable that why, and to really start with those bite-sized pieces to bring the people together that understand the importance of those pieces and to be able to build something correct the first time so that when it does warrant having a dedicated data team, it can scale appropriately and you're building on a foundation that's really strong and has been built on quality principles so that it can engage and grow over time. But again, to not be intimidated by the concept of governance, but to really take it in stride, take it step by step. And I think the other piece, especially as CDT, we're an enabling function, we're an empowering department, hopefully you all feel that way, but we're here as a service provider to you all, and so there is really incredible opportunity in partnership around this as well. We don't need to start from scratch every time, and there's a really clean way to learn from each other's best practices in order to start that small one bite at a time for governance.
Jason?
Yeah, data governance is one of those things that strikes fear into the hearts of the uninitiated. And one thing, actually building on all of the things that have been said, is the way I'd summarize is the foundational thing is a mindset shift. I get more inquiries than you would imagine, but maybe you would imagine, we get a lot of these inquiries around, hey Jason, do you have templates for data governance? And my response to that is always, what are you actually trying to do? What's the problem you're trying to solve within that? Because data governance you can get a manual, there's DAMA, there's all sorts of great stuff out there, but that's actually like, we've got the information, we know what to do, but actually putting it into practice, we need to do all the things that have been said here, which is really to center on what are we actually trying to accomplish with data, start there. And then naturally, what the governance questions emerge from that, because Cradle-to-Career is a great example of this, CalHHS, great example. In order to serve their constituents, the people they need to serve with their programs, with their departments, they need to bring multiple data. They have to, in order to actually serve them, to know how the outcomes are. So that necessitates, so if we start with that vision of where we want to head, and you work backwards from there, you quickly discover, oh wow, we need to figure out some things around how do we share data? How do we define? What does this word mean? What do you think it means? What is it? So there's all these sorts of little things that can emerge if you start with that why and you center on that. Then it's a lot easier to start moving incrementally forward because you all at least have, and bringing multiple folks to the table, not just data professionals, not just technical, although you heard it today, Katie, you are all data professionals, regardless of your title. But bringing all those people at the beginning, getting them getting them centered on what actually we're trying to do together, and then that creates the framework and the approach where, as you are trying to solve these governance issues, you're doing it together. You're kind of addressing things as they come up. You don't have to figure out everything out all at once. In fact, to Katie's point, starting small and just starting. Like, that's the other thing I always like. I'm like, just start somewhere. And it can be a little thing. It can be, you can scope it down. We often get very anxious about, because data governance, it does strike fear, admittedly. It can feel really overwhelming. And so if you start there and you're just going to be overwhelmed and you might not move forward. So I think going to the purpose and then bringing the right people together, that allows you to move things forward.
I love those themes of inclusivity and the why are you doing that, and just start. Like, don't spend all the time talking, just start. I think to that point, one of those things that you need to figure out as you're starting to do this are, data sharing agreements. And I was involved in crafting and implementing one at Health and Human Services, and then when I was in the Governor Newsom's office, administration-wide. But the one that you're managing is by far the most complex governmental one that I've seen at Cradle-to-Career. So could you talk a little bit about how that came together and how it works?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to this. One is the legal agreements, and the other is the governance, right, of who gets to make decisions and about what. So starting with the legal agreements, we have one overarching legal agreement called the Participation Agreement. It now has 18 signatures at the bottom of it. And this means that across education entities who might be subject, for example, to FERPA or the Higher Education Act, Health and Human Services entities, HIPAA, we're getting earnings data from EDD. There are a lot of different entities who have overlapping and different kinds of rules and regulations and laws that they're subject to. But we did the work through this planning process that preceded the launch of our office and in the first year to come to agreement on one overarching legal agreement. It's the same one. Everyone has signed the same one. And the benefit of that is that then when it comes to actually building our cloud-based data warehouse, bringing the data together, there's a common foundation for how we make decisions around who's responsible for what in terms of data privacy, cybersecurity, how are the data actually being integrated, how are we making decisions around that. The other thing about it is the importance of being flexible. So initially there were 16 signatures on that document. We've had more entities join. So the Department of Developmental Services, for instance, was engaging with us and said, we'd love to have our data included too. You have information your partners have shared around long-term outcomes, right, in schools and in the labor market. We'd really love to know how the people we serve are doing. And because we had a governance structure in place and a common legal agreement in place, it was actually relatively smooth. Our legal teams worked together. Here's the participation agreement. Would you like to sign on? They were added, and we didn't have to recirculate it with the other 16, 17 entities because of how that was structured. So that's a long-winded way of saying if it's about bringing data together across different silos in government, taking the time at the outset to have one unifying legal agreement that can be flexible over time. We're not signing this every single year. It's intended to last. Can really smooth the process in the long run. The second piece is about governance. So just grain of salt before I describe our governance structure. Ours is possibly one of the largest and most over-engineered governance structures for a data integration effort that we've seen. So I'll describe what we have, and you can decide where it may or may not make sense for other applications. But I report to a 21-person governing board. So that 21-person governing board is composed half of
that should horrify all of you, by the way.
Yes. So if anyone else here has 21 bosses, let me know. So half of this governing board is representatives of our data providers. So like the secretary of CalHHS or their designee, right? The superintendent of public instruction for K-12, right? So each of those entities have a seat at the table, and again, it's from a policy standpoint, right? It's the executive or their designee. And then the other half of the governing board are people who represent the end users of the data system. So these are appointees of the governor, of the assembly, of the Senate, an assembly member, and a senator. And so what this means is that there's a formal structure for making decisions about what is this data system for. And naturally, there are differing incentives, right, between the data providers who are responsible for the stewardship of their data, Californians' data that they're stewarding, and the appointees for the end users of the data system who will always want more, right? What additional data points can we add? What more functionality? Can you make it more accessible to us? And having everyone at the same table taking a vote on how our office does the work provides a structure for that. In addition to that governing board, we also have two 16-person advisory boards, one focused on the data, one focused on community engagement, user-centered design, who then make recommendations about the work. So that's 53, if you were counting. That's a lot of board members to serve in Bagley Keene public meetings. But the upside of it is that when questions come up, it's very clear who's making the decision and how. So for example, a week or two ago, I was presenting to the California State University trustees. So this is like the leadership of the whole CSU system, biggest university system, a four-year university system in the country. And one of the trustees asked me the question, well, how you have CSU's data, how are you engaging with us on security and privacy questions? And there was a structured answer to that, right? You have a member on the board, and we have a security policies task force that every one of our data providers has a seat on. So you're in this with us, you're making these decisions with us. So it's a lot of work to have any kind of formal governance structure, especially if you're doing this through public meetings. We have a many-page governance manual that specifies exactly how we're going to decide, how data points get added, how the neutrality of our office is maintained, and all of that. But the upside of having created that governance structure from the start is that it's not just relying on one or two champions within government saying, hey, let's do this cool thing together. And then if they move on to other roles, the things are harder to maintain, right? It's a structured thing. When we take decisions, we know who gets to decide. So again, governance is basically who gets to decide about what, and it helps to write that down in some fashion.
I wanted to just draw on something Regan said about the large governance and square that with the just start mentality. It's actually that it's context dependent, right? And what C2C has done and what was done before and all that planning was meeting the complexity of that and getting to clarity, and there was a structure for that. So, and it was important to do that work up front and get all of that worked out because of, we're talking about working with students' data, right? We've got to get that right. And so no small thing. And so I think you do want to take into account the context that you're operating in. And so if you are just getting started, sometimes it's useful to start with something that's lower risk or if you don't have maybe a larger structured project. But to draw on a little bit what Marianne said about just a couple champions working together, that sometimes is what ends up happening. And one thing I would challenge leaders in here to do, or in that who are trying to do this, is really engage people at the executive level if you are trying to champion this, but do it in their terms. So that's where it's like, don't talk about, I got to do this master data management thing. Like, don't talk about that. Don't start with that. Talk about, hey, I hear you have some problems at the executive office, measuring impacts or outcomes for this particular community or this particular group. And is that true? Right? And then bring them in to the thinking at the right level around why we need to do something. Again, centering on that why. And then that way you do have that visibility, or you're bringing people along in a way that actually is acknowledging where you actually want to go with the data governance initiatives. But going to an executive and being like, we want to do this master data management thing. They're going to be like, for what reason? Why? What's the cost? So it really, we do need to center on those outcomes and what we're trying to build toward, and help other people understand that. And that's the thing that I think is a responsibility for those of us in this field, technology, data, to bring this stuff to meet those folks where they are as well. So we need to work collaboratively. We need to work together. We need to understand our roles in it, but we also need to all remember that there are humans in the middle of this.
Yeah. I think that's also where it's really important that you have this written document it's very clear what the process looks like. It's very clear what you're going to be doing, and it's not, well, I just want to share data with everybody. Like, we're just going to throw it all in one common repository, and anybody that wants access to it can, and watch people melt down. And so it's very clear that no, that's not what we're doing. There's specific use cases. People still have to articulate that. There's security protocols. I think one of the biggest components that I've seen in effective data sharing agreements is the cultural change aspect of, it's not your data. You don't hold on to it and don't share it with anybody else, but instead, and I know in the Health and Human Services, and I believe in the administration-wide one, the default's yes. Right, that when somebody comes to you with a use case and they say, I need access to this data, the default is yes. And then you can articulate why it's no. But that's statute. Statutorily, I can't share this with you. Instead of, I come to you with hat in hand and say, I'd really like access to your data, and you say no. And that's the end of the conversation. And so I think that having that governance process where it's also clear who makes that decision? When you get to know and you don't have agreement between the two entities on no, where does that reside? And any thoughts or experience you all have with those aspects of this?
For me, a big portion of this is a precursor to open data. So this is a major kind of function of what my team is doing and is a champion for is when there are those yeses, not just the legal sharing between departments that is within a contained environment, but when the yes is even larger and the sharing becomes to the full public. I think the beauty of the governance that you described as complex and maybe overpopulated as it is the support that comes with that, as well as that kind of shared language, Jason, what you described earlier of when a term or a new data point comes online to your sharing, there's a shared definition that comes with it so that it's consistent across the board. And something that we see in open data is this eagerness to share data, to make it public, to do that sharing activity. But the reality of, governance is going to come for you at some point in time. And the reality of having shared definitions of unfortunately being sometimes an afterthought when data is publicly shared, that now when we want to use data across topic areas or across departments that is in a public environment like the Open Data Portal, we sometimes see a disconnect in the way that terminology is used, the way that data points are defined, and it adds a layer of work now when we want to use that data and bring it together in a public space. That takes us back to kind of step one of governance, of not just deciding to open, but now we have to go back and do the definition setting. So again, just a plug for you all to think about the investment up front of the value that it brings to have that type of governance at a foundational level, so that when you grow and move beyond kind of legal data sharing within departments to then opening up to the public, you've really built an on-ramp that's really powerful and it adds value to the data at the end of the day, as opposed to, look, we've opened thousands of data sets, but no one can use them because we don't have definitions around them.
And I was going to build on Jason's point about just getting started. Sometimes there's going to be some data sets that the answer is going to be no, or at least not now, and we're going to have to do some extra work to figure out. But what can we get a yes to? Almost every department somewhere has some kind of data they can share. So let's start with that. That allows us to at least get working on some of those, privacy settings, some of those governance foundations with the data that we can get, with the assumptions that we are going to do amendments, that we don't have to get the ideal data sharing agreement from square one and have all the data that we could ever, that's never going to happen. You'll take 10 years to write that data agreement. So start with what you can get folks excited, and that's going to bring up new use cases. That's going to bring new departments going, hey, I want to sign that participation agreement because this is going to be so useful now that something exists that is tangible for me to take a look at. And so just getting started is a really powerful, and if the answer is no, well, what can we start with is a good follow-up.
One thing I want to offer to this is, Mike, you actually mentioned the interagency data exchange agreement. And one thing that occurred to me as folks were talking about that particular framework, it's actually fairly straightforward and simple. And in a lot of ways, it separates out the legal sort of boilerplate into one area, and that's the agreement. Like everyone has signed on to that in the not everyone, but most of the executive branch. And so we've agreed on that as this sort of broader framework. But then for the actual sharing and working out what the sharing, there's something called a business use case proposal, and there's a template for it, and you fill that out. But the template is not the thing. The process that the template that's embedded in the template is the thing. Because what ends up happening, and I know this because I'm a user of this as well as a recipient of those agreements in my role as State Chief Data Officer, what happens is it actually forces you to have some conversations, but at the right level. You're not arguing over the legal. You're actually talking about, well, how are we going to share it? What's going to look like? Who's going to have access to it? How long are you going to have it? The really, really important things that you need to know to do the sharing of the data. And in the process of actually working those out, it can actually surface a lot of things, and you can actually solve problems even going through that process. And so, which is what I've seen in my use of it. And the great thing is, we as State Chief Data Officer, we basically get those agreements. We're not in the approval path. That's not the governance on this, but they're expected to be sort of filed with us, and as part of that filing, we track metrics, and it was over 90% of folks who have filed these. It's like 90 or 100 filings so far, or business use case proposals. It's like 90% that are saying that it saved them time. It was like went from what could have been a 12-month or 2-year process down to months. So there are actually significant savings as well in time if we get some of these governance practices well laid down.
If I can jump in on that, I think your point about just start somewhere, right? Not reinventing the wheel and using what already exists. So just to be clear, that the IDEA, which is I believe what you're talking about, this legal agreement, that was the template foundation for the Cradle-to-Career legal agreements as well. And there have been multiple conversations I've had with people in different departments where they say, oh, our department has signed your legal agreements? And like, yeah, and they've also signed the IDEA, and it exists, and here's the process, right? Here's how you can do a BUCP and use that so that you don't have to start from scratch.
We got to do better marketing, by the way. But we're working on it.
Yeah. That's what we're doing right now.
But thank you for spreading the good news. Data share.
Well, and it's awesome, right, that exists in these multiple locations, because I think the other thing that comes with that is establishing that mindset of the thought process that you just described, where the legal terms can be set aside because they have been hammered out, and now we're thinking use case specific, how is the data used, right, and thinking through that process, because that has ultimately informed as well the way that the Gen AI consultation is happening as departments consider procurement of Gen AI. It's a risk assessment at the use case level with considerations around data use, right, and so it follows that same mindset. And so you all have primed the pump of enabling that mindset across our departments so that it kind of becomes infused throughout around use case specific and data value that gets added in, which is really cool.
So one of the themes that has come up a few times in this conversation now is this tension that you have between privacy and sharing. And so Jason, would you talk a little bit about how you think about that tension and what are some ways that you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a real tension. So the jargony way is privacy portability, or protection portability, privacy portability. But what we're really talking about is the sharing of data for all the things that we talked about earlier in terms of actually helping residents or helping a customer, right? So that's the portability part. We need to bring those things together. And the protection side of it is we need to do it safely, securely. We absolutely need to do that. And there can be a tension between the two because, well, once you start talking about, I got to bring data from over here to here you have to start making some decisions about how am I going to secure that? How am I going to do that? Right? So that's where the challenge can happen. It's a solvable challenge. Like, it's absolutely solvable. It's been done. It's not impossible. But it can be hard for all the reasons actually we've laid out already in terms of just collaboration, bringing the right people, naming the thing that you're actually trying to do. And I would underline or underscore all that earlier sentiment that helps here too. You get that why right, then it becomes much easier to be more thoughtful about, okay, what are the actual problems we need to solve in order for this sharing to happen? You start to get a sense of, oh, is this going to be an ongoing data sharing thing? Okay, oh, we might need to be automated. It starts to unfurl some of the things you need to consider. But you start with that problem, and then that allows you then to design through, and you should, if folks aren't familiar with this, go ahead and Google privacy by design. There are lots of good frameworks and approaches for actually building privacy into the way you develop technology very intentionally. And so, and actually, they're used in an agile context as well. So there are ways to bring in privacy by design, security, et cetera, in a way that's still iterative, that's still moving forward, that's safe and secure. And I think actually sandboxes and some of that are a good example of some of that for Gen AI work. But yeah, you really just need to get pointed in the right direction, and then those things start to become a little bit easier to answer because you know the actual things you're trying to answer. If you stay at the abstract, it's just going to be hard. You're just going to have a lot of people saying all the reasons why it's hard and we can't do it and all this. But once you get into what it might take, then you can start assessing. You can have technology folks looking at it and saying, oh yeah, if you want to do this well, you're going to have to think about these things. Oh, if you want to do this well from a data perspective, you're going to have to think about these things, right? So you can get that scoping right at the beginning, and then begin to sort of build your solutions around data sharing and managing that security. That's at the sort of, again, that use case level. I think over time, as you build in an organization, you can kind of build around those use cases and create frameworks that make that sharing easier. Maybe you can think about centralization for certain analytics workloads, but the data stays over here. So there's ways you can start to build up those designs to solve multiple problems, but I think one way to get there is actually to start with something that is use case driven and then begin to expand around that, at least from a technology and governance and all that, and kind of bringing all those things together.
I'm just going to jump on the use case piece. One thing that happened during the Cradle-to-Career planning process is that people actually mocked up personas for different users and why would they need the data, and it guides those decisions around privacy, right? So one persona is, this is a guidance counselor who needs to help their specific list of students navigate California's pretty complicated list of courses you have to take to get into a four-year college, right? That guidance counselor needs to know, right, Marianne has taken these classes, but she's missing that one. So that means individual level data, right? For a lot of the other use cases, if it's about folks here in Sacramento or others needing to know big picture trends, information on groups of people is fine, right? And so that's where we developed a data suppression protocol and said, okay, our data tools will never display things for fewer than 30 people, and here's how that's going to work out. So I completely just want to underline the piece about as soon as you move away from the abstract towards very specific use cases, it can help resolve what might seem like an intractable question, like, I don't know, we might sometimes need individual level data, and sometimes you don't want to reveal that, so I guess we're stuck, right? It's like, no, actually we can partner with another organization who's doing this with schools specifically for the individual data, and our data system is going to be about groups of people.
And I think the exciting part is that the technology is there at this point, right? Technology is not the problem, and there's so many options for access control, for secure workspaces, for enclaves, so on and so forth, right, that we're starting to make use of. It's the governance piece that needs to catch up to it. And we need to figure out in this particular context with this particular use case, this is what the governance needs to look like. And it's so easy to just jump into the technology solution but it's not going to work without that governance hand in hand.
So Agnieszka, we've talked a little bit about being inclusive in this, and what role does storytelling play in that? So how do you use that to broaden this group and get people away from that siloed mindset?
Well, Marianne, you just
Marianne,
talked about,
yes,
you just talked about the personas, right? The guidance counselor versus the researcher versus, and when I think about this, It's so easy to say, okay, we are moving away from a program-centric perspective to a person-centered perspective, and that language is great for when you're doing an MOU or when you're doing, a data sharing agreement. It's really great to plug in that language. It's quick and it gets you to the point. But when you say, we're doing this because there's new parents at a hospital right now and they are way too sleep deprived to try to navigate our complex systems to try to figure out what they're eligible for, right? That hits different. We're doing this because there's a student who is about to graduate high school and they are trying to figure out what their next step is and they need information to be able to make a good decision on that. That hits different, and it hits different in a few ways. Number one, it gets us to what's the problem that we're trying to actually solve in a real way that resonates with folks because they know that high school student, they know that new parent, it makes it real for us, right? It also helps them see how they're a part of the solution and how breaking down their data silo is gonna actually support the people that they're dedicated to serving. And so when we really do put these scenarios, these personas in front of people and tell the story of here's the impact that it's gonna make to break down these data silos, everybody's excited. Everybody's willing to move things and overcome the legal barriers that inevitably are going to be there. Technology barriers that are inevitably going to be there. They're going to be there because they're putting that story at the forefront. And so storytelling to me, it's the why, right? We have to have that common shared why. We've mentioned this a few times, but it's also effectively telling that why. It's not the technical speak. It's really effectively telling the story of that why, because that's what's going to get things moving, and that's what it's going to help people see how they're part of this whole. People are not just their sliver of here's their healthcare and here's their housing and here's their food, and no, they're a whole person and we need to serve the whole person.
I think another thing, Agnieszka and I were chatting right before we came on stage, and she used a very specific word that has come up a handful of times in thinking about data ownership, right? The department owns the data. It feels very heavy and legal, and there's a lot of ramifications that come with ownership. And Agnieszka changed that language in our conversation to stewardship, that we are stewards of data, and the data belongs to our residents that we serve, and this is a foundational element of what public service is. There are legal kind of silos, if you will, right? There are limitations to what it means to share that data, full stop. And so to do it within the context of the use case. But I think as stewards and as we all are here in public service, it's just foundational to kind of who we are and how we show up. Even those of you from our vendor community who are supporting us as public servants, I think that language change of stewardship also tells a really powerful story and message to the data owners, and enables them to kind of take on this higher level value of what it is to share that data across departments where it needs to be shared in order to be appropriate stewards of that information and to serve our residents.
Maybe expanding a little bit. So take us to that next level of this. So establishing the data governance, having these abilities to share, how's that foundational to what a lot is being talked about today of emerging technologies, especially things like generative AI?
Yeah, the favorite buzzword, I think the secretary used buzzword earlier, right? The term buzzword earlier. And as we saw in kind of the lightning round this morning, I think it was from Databricks, where's the data, who has access to the data, right? Data is so foundational to everything. And right, to be a broken record on foundation and back to basics, having governance in place, having data quality, data privacy, security, management, having that stewardship, right? Having these kind of foundational pieces, pillars of data governance in place enables the kind of failing fast, like we talk about, the innovative movement, being able to jump into a generative AI space, to be able to tackle new technology quickly because you've worked on and built a powerful foundation that can support that type of new emerging tech. When that foundation is not there, it will come back, right? It is a requirement, and so you'll jump into something that you're ready to innovate on, and you find out my data isn't in a place to use. I don't have metadata that describes what's happening, and you get brought back to the starting line. And so you've started a project and now you're spending because resources are going into this project. And it turns out that now you have to do this iterative work on managing and upgrading your data in order for it to be useful. When if there is a data governance program in place already, it enables what we have all heard about already today of moving fast, of innovating, of doing these modular movements within the technology. So again, a major plug for investing your time in data governance means you'll be able to practice and to try and to get into a sandbox earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I have appreciated about the emergence of generative AI is actually, I think I'm hearing this conversation more and more of people that aren't in the data space and recognition of, oh wow, yeah, our data is our asset, right? People at business level, not just in the public sector, in the private sector as well, where there's a recognition. They're connecting the dots. They're like, this really shiny fun thing that I want to participate in, I can't do it if I don't have this in line. And some of these things, they don't always go in one direction. We do want to have data governance foundations, but I think what's nice about what's happening is people are recognizing that, and it's raising we should start getting this right. And one thing to offer even there with data quality or just do we have the right data? Some of that, one way to kind of think through that, even just at an organizational level, is just how can you apply a prototyping mindset to even that? If you have an analyst, looking at data, doing some exploratory data analysis real quick on the things that you already know, or just kind of surfacing the kinds of potential issues, right, that you could maybe imagine. Do we have the right fields? What are the null values in our columns? All these kinds of things underneath the data that get in the way of those things. So there's ways in which bringing the right people in the room to even just kind of talk about that and flesh it out can actually be pretty quick. It doesn't have to take a long time, and it can reveal some of the gaps you have even before you get into a big thing. And you can prototype a little bit, and you can start. So it starts that iterative mindset even earlier before you're getting into the technology, but you're still advancing knowledge and awareness of the state of your data, which is ultimately what we're trying to do with better governance. And that's not, again, it's not a straight line. But if we can start a little bit further back here, not having to go back to the starting line because we've already gone too far in this direction, it will be a little less churn. We can kind of get those iterations right earlier and then keep going.
For all of you that are trying to figure out where to start, there's already a starting point. You're not starting from zero. Focus on the why. Why are you doing this? Don't just do it to do it. And that applies to every aspect of this. Ask yourself why throughout. Be inclusive. This is not the job of data scientists. This is a whole government effort. You need to bring in the policy and program people. You need legal. You need data scientists. All of these folks need to be working together. You need leadership, somebody that's able to focus all of those people in the right direction, and just get started. So join me in thanking the panel.